also wanted to, they wanted to make sure you knew about the Montana Hunger Coalition, which merged with the Montana Food Bank network in 1999. And Minkie has been on the board of the network since then. Besides providing food to agencies around the state, the Montana Food Bank Network also works as an advocacy for hunger and has formed the Food Policy Council. The council has expanded the work of the previous Hunger Coalition and studies hunger, food insecurity in the state, as well as working on solutions in multiple ways. And I think, how long are we ready to go? Just about there? Okay, well, please give Minkie a welcome.
Thanks, Dane. I hope you can all hear me in the back. If you can't, raise your hand, so I try to yell a little bit more. But I appreciate the opportunity of being here today. The topic of this lecture series through the Ethics Department is Promises and Perils of Building a Just and Sustainable Future. And I think it's particularly fitting that we talk about hunger in Montana and try to have some thought and discussion, if possible, on what the potential is for the low-income and the vulnerable population in terms of a sustainable future. That's one segment of the population that we don't always think about in terms of sustainable futures. So I think it's a very fitting place for me to talk about it. When you think about it, the United States produces more than enough food to feed everybody in this country and beyond. We are leaders in the world in terms of production of several agriculture products like grains and soybeans and numerous other items. We export food to many, many countries in the world, and we're always looking for new markets. Our grocery stores are bursting with food, as we all have seen, I'm sure. There's food everywhere. Just have to look around, whether it's a convenience store or a pop machine or any number of things. Yet there is hunger in the midst of plenty in this country. Now I want to clarify that hunger in America is not what you think of in terms of hunger in some of the very poor and devastated areas of the world like Africa or North Korea, where there's famine and starvation, and it's a very sad situation. Hunger in America is more in the form of food insecurity, and this manifests itself by resulting in chronic malnutrition or chronic undernutrition. And undernutrition doesn't necessarily mean not enough food. It can mean a lot of the wrong food also. So back in 1995, the federal government decided that they were seeing more and more hunger in America in terms of what I just described. And at that time, they started measuring hunger in the United States through the US Census Bureau. And in order to measure hunger, they first had to define it. What was the scale by which they would measure hunger? Well, they have three categories. There is, of course, the category that measures food security. And food security is the ability to access food at all times by the family members in a way that is a sustainable, consistent manner, and where they don't have to resort to emergency feeding, and where they can get enough nutrition for the family. So that's how they define food security. Food insecurity is, of course, the inability to do that. That means families can get food sometimes in a consistent manner and sometimes not. And usually families that are food insecure tend to adapt by doing several things. The first thing they do is make sure that their children have enough to eat. But as a result, they themselves don't have enough to eat. The second thing they do is reduce the quality of the food they're buying and then reduce the quantity of the food that they're buying. Now, a third category in this measure of food security through the Census Bureau is a category actually called hunger. And in that category, not only are the adults not getting enough to eat in a sustainable manner, but the children are also hungry. So this measure was started back in 1995, and this first slide shows you just in the last 4 years. 1999 was the year when we had the lowest amount of hunger in the United States. Since 99, it has started to go up. And as of 2004, you all probably know that by the time we get the census data, it's a year later. But as of 2004, there were 38 million people in the United States that were food insecure as well as hungry. That's the number, and it's actually pretty close to the number of people living in poverty. So who are the poor and hungry in Montana? Well, they tend to be a largely marginalized population. It's not apparent who is poor and hungry. And people who are poor or living with very little means don't particularly care to be identified. Many of them feel guilty and responsible for the situation they are in, when in fact, it's the circumstances of their lives that have brought them to that stage in their lives. Poor people or people who are hungry are not looking for pity or sympathy. And one has to admire the fortitude with which they get through each day, just trying to get through with all the things they have to take care of, plus trying to find food. But nevertheless, being poor and hungry has a serious emotional toll. It creates a lot of despair. It sometimes causes embarrassment, and it certainly can be very humiliating to say, I don't have money to buy food. People who are living on the edge, it doesn't take very much to fall into poverty. If you're a lower middle class family, and the working member of the family is suddenly laid off or their hours of work are cut, that family will slip off the edge very easily because young families don't have a lot of savings. Or a single mom who is trying to raise 3 children and one child gets seriously ill and she has to stay home with the child because the child can't go to the sitter. She may lose hours of work. She may even lose her job and fall into a worse situation than before. Or even if the old family car doesn't work and the engine needs repair or the tires have to be changed and it's an expense the family can't handle, then they don't have enough money for food. So people who are low income and hungry are dealing with small disasters all the time, every day in their lives. And I think it's very important to recognize that hunger is a symptom of poverty. Not only that, but lack of access to food has become a barometer for an indication of what the family status is like. When people don't have money for food, it means they've spent all their other income on other necessities, and the last thing they were thinking about is food because they were hoping something would show up from somewhere. And that's when they hit rock bottom. You can't delay paying the rent unless you want to be homeless. You have to pay for your heating. You have to pay for your gas because you have to go to work. You have to pay for childcare. If you've got medical bills that are outstanding, they have to be covered. So those things get taken care of first, and money for food is not considered with the hope that something else will come up. And to add to it, and I want to take a few moments at the end to talk about it, recent actions by the Congress and the administration are going to add significant more concerns to this whole issue of hunger in the United States. The other aspect of being hungry, as I said, is chronic undernutrition or malnutrition, which is important for everyone, all of us here, every human being through the entire life cycle. In fact, the importance of nutrition begins in the prenatal stage, when a woman, before even she gets pregnant. I mean, in some countries where women have a deficiency of folic acid in the prenatal stage, their children are born with cleft palate and cleft lip. But what I'm saying is nutrition is important for every stage. But in infants and children, it is very, very important, not only because the children need to be able to grow physically for their bones and muscles and all that, but children who don't get enough nutrition have all kinds of problems, such as the inability to fight infections. As a result, they are sick a lot, they miss school, they have a lot of absenteeism. Many of them have iron deficiency anemia, which has a strong impact on their cognitive development. So poor nutrition affects their mental growth and their development. And one of the greatest examples of why nutrition is important for children is since the start of the school breakfast program in the United States, which was started a few years ago, not as long as the lunch program, but it has been around for quite a while now. And if you talk to teachers, especially grade school teachers, they will tell you that they know which children are coming to school without breakfast in the morning. And I'm not talking about somebody who got up late and didn't have time to eat. I'm talking about day after day, either not having anything to eat or not the right thing to eat. These children, when they came to school in the morning, were restless or just stared vacantly at the board. They had behavior problems. They couldn't sit still. They were always getting in trouble. That same child, after they received lunch, was a whole different child. That child was no longer hungry. In fact, for the longest time, it wasn't recognized that some of the kids that were considered attention deficit disorder were in fact malnourished. The school breakfast program has really demonstrated what a difference nutrition makes to children. In terms of adults, I think we all recognize that we need good nutrition, but when people have limited income and limited choices of food, as well as a limited time to prepare good meals, then there is a tendency to pick up whatever is easiest, fastest, and gives the most satisfaction in terms of calories. And that has led to a concern about obesity, both in children and in adults. And there's a whole section on discussion about the connection between poverty and obesity that I won't get into because we don't have time, but it is a topic of great concern. And in terms of seniors, again, I don't think that requires much validation other than to say that in all the years that I worked at the hospital, when we would get seniors, especially seniors living alone or from a nursing home, who would come in for problems like pneumonia, when you looked at their charts to see what the primary diagnosis was, it was malnutrition. Because lack of nutrition affects the immune system and the body's not able to fight infection, and they went down very fast. Now, I want to take just a minute to talk about how we as a community view hunger. There is no one alive who wants to see somebody hungry. We all feel, our hearts go out to people who are hungry. We feel great compassion for them. But at the same time, I'm not sure if people have enough of an understanding of how widespread and enormous this problem is. We also know that hunger is related to poverty, but which one of us here can raise their hand and say, I'll solve poverty by tomorrow? It's just an overwhelming task. It's just boundless. It's beyond our comprehension. So then we do, most of us do the next best thing that we can, which is donate food to the local food bank or food kitchen or help in some way, and it does create a sense of relief. And I think that's wonderful, and I hope all of you who have donated in any way to the food bank here in Missoula or the Perils Center or any number of agencies in Missoula will always continue to do so. But if we're talking about a sustainable future for the low income and the poor, we have to look at the fact that if we're going to only prop up our food banks and keep giving them more food, what are we doing for the future of those people? And do they always have to rely on an emergency system? That's food insecurity. And so it's a bit of a paradox, because if you've seen the work of food banks, both in this town and around the state, they do an outstanding job of what they have to manage with and with the little resources. But the fact is, we tend to accept as a society that food banks are there and therefore we're okay. In fact, we were talking about it at the Food Bank Network the other day. By the way, I meant to introduce Kate Bradford. When we started, she's Director of Advocacy at the Montana Food Bank Network. I'm sorry. We were talking about it the other day that there are 4 or 5 counties in Montana that don't have a food bank. And what shall we do about it? We need to start more food banks. That's how we're thinking, because we think this is the answer to hunger. And that's not sustainability. I want to take just a minute to talk about the poverty levels in our state. But this is just to give you an idea of what poverty levels mean. See if I can do this. If a family of 4 earns $20,000, they are at 100% of the poverty, according to the 2006 measures of poverty. That same family, if they earn $30,000, are at 130% of poverty, and if they are earning $37,000, this is a family of 4, remember, for 1 year, they're at 185% of poverty. So the question is, if somebody is at 100% of poverty when they're earning $20,000, does that mean that if they're earning $25,000 a year, they are no longer poor? A family of 4? But that's how poverty is measured. And I'm not faulting the measure, I'm just saying that's the standard that's used. But it can be misleading, because what we have found, or what has been found in national hunger studies, is until a family reaches this level of 185% of poverty, they are still hungry. Once they go over that 185%, they seem that there's a pretty significant drop in the level of food insecurity and hunger. And yet, when we look at poverty levels, what we are seeing is those measured at 100%. So based on those measured at 100% only, in Montana, our poverty level is 14.6%, which translates to about 131,000 people. Now, it's interesting to note that in all the northwestern states around us, Montana has the highest level of poverty. The states that have greater poverty than us are mostly in the south. And if you look at poverty levels for specific groups in the population, children under the age of 18, it's almost 20%. Actually, children under the age of 5, the poverty level is something like 25%. It's that high. The highest area where there's poverty is families where single women are taking care of children and raising young children. It's 41.6%. In terms of food insecurity, the measure I talked to you about earlier, Montana's level for food insecurity is 12.2%. And out of that number, 4.7% are truly hungry. That means there isn't enough food for the children to have. And this translates to about 47,000 families. Back in 2004, at the Montana Food Bank Network, we realized that we were seeing a lot of signs and indicators that hunger was increasing in the state. We saw a tremendous increase in the demand for food, and some of this is in the handout I gave you, so I'm not going to go into great detail. We also noticed that people in the public food assistance programs, the number of people registered or participating was not that high, especially in the food stamp program, which is an outstanding program for reducing hunger. There was an increase in obesity, which again hunger is not the only cause, but it's linked to hunger in many ways. We noticed that food banks and pantries around the state were calling the network office and saying, we need help desperately. More than half the food banks in this state are run by volunteers. And if you go to small rural food banks around Montana, you'll find that they have very limited resources. They do get food from the Montana Food Bank Network, but it's still very limited. They're only open 1 to 2 days a month, and that too for anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. And if they don't have food, they don't open at all. These small rural food banks depend mainly on food from the network because there's very little food they can get from others in the community. The communities are poor, so they really can't expect and don't get a lot of donations locally. In addition, no matter how hard food banks try, and they do try very hard, it's difficult for food banks to meet the family's nutritional needs. Most of the food banks in the state allow people to come 6 times a year. Now, we don't eat just 6 times a year. And I will say that in case of emergencies, many of them do allow people to come back and get extra food. But by and large, the average is 6 visits a year. In some cases, it's 12 visits a year. And when they provide food, a food box, the idea is to provide enough for 2 to 4 days worth of food. And some families have been able to stretch it longer. So we conducted a survey of 342 clients in 7 food banks around the state, and these were both eastern and western parts of the state, rural, urban, and reservation areas. And this also I have put in your handout, but I want to point out that more than 80% had come several times in the year because they didn't just need emergency food one time. And 41% adults had gone without food or skipped meals so that children or others in the family could have enough to eat. It was interesting to note that 48% were receiving food stamps. Now, the food stamp, the reason for this was people who are on food stamps seem to be the poorest of the poor. They were the ones who were living at 50 to 60% of the poverty level. And even though the food stamps do provide almost up to $90 a month worth of food, the most they could stretch it out was 2 to 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, but that's all. And they didn't have money to buy food for the rest of the time in the month. Again, more than half of the clients had children under the age of 18. We saw that the poverty levels of our clients ranged from 55% to 68 or so percent in the urban and 90% on the reservations. And generally, for families with children, it was 76%. That means people at 100% of poverty or lower. Almost half of the people we surveyed were working, had at least one person working, and half of them had more than one jobs. While Montana boasts of having lots of jobs, we ranked 46th in the nation for medium household income. And we also ranked 4th in the nation for the number of people with 2 jobs. I believe we rank even higher for the number of people with 3 jobs. So it's a very ironic situation that people who are employed are still very, very poor. Most had some level of education, some as high as graduate, but most had had at least high school or two-year community college education. But it did not lift them out of poverty. These are just some of the comments from some of the people that we talked to, and I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but every situation that we encountered was very, very important and touching. There were people who had come to the food banks for the first time and just could not believe that they were there. This is not where they expected to be. There were people who were making mortgage payments on their home and payments on their car, and the husband got laid off. The wife had to have surgery. They had 2 little kids, no savings or minimal savings. They had to give it all up, and the last thing they thought of was money for food. And so they were in the food bank and just mortified, not because they're not treated well. They are treated extremely well in the food banks, but that they had to ask for emergency help. A large part of what we did in our study was ask them why they had to have emergency food. And I don't know how clear this is to read, but these were the primary reasons that we found as the causes of food insecurity. The low income was top of the list, fixed wages and fixed incomes, as with the older people. Healthcare costs were very big. Unemployment was a major factor. And then there are a few other reasons, as you can see. By the way, of the people that were not employed in our study, about 47% were looking for work. The remainder had either been retired or were disabled and could not work. Now, last year, Montana was one of the states that took part in a national study of hunger through a national group known as America's Second Harvest, and some of you may have heard about that. And I just lifted out a few of the data for, this is specifically for Montana because it was interesting. They found an even higher level of people coming to food banks that were employed, 57%, whereas we found 44%. The income levels of the clients was similar to what we had found in food bank clients. 67% had unpaid medical bills that they were concerned about. The other interesting question they asked was how often people had to choose between money for food and money for other needs. And they found that 60% had the tough choice between food and heating fuels, 43% between food and rent, and 32% between food and medical care costs. This is the very essence of why people who are hungry poverty has a direct impact on their situation. They have to have the money for other things first. Just so you know, in terms of actual numbers, last year the Montana Food Bank Network served 476,000 clients. Now, we don't have that many people in Montana, so you have to understand that there are a lot of in that number, there are a lot of repeat visits. But that's how many people were fed at one time or another, or given food in some form, or given a hot meal through the food sent by the Montana Food Bank Network. As you can see, there was quite a significant jump from the 2004 numbers, which was 263,000 clients. In terms of total pounds of food that was given out, the network alone sent out 3 million pounds of food to the 145 agencies around the state. In addition, the local food banks themselves collected donations in their communities. Another 4 million pounds of donated food was distributed. So totally, 7 million pounds of food was distributed through food banks last year in Montana. And so I want to take a few minutes to talk about what is bringing all this on? And again, going back to the fact that we're talking about a sustainable future. Some of you probably know that the 2006 budget was just passed by Congress in February. A 700-page document that they read overnight and voted on the next morning. That's how much time they had to read it. And the big picture item is that $40 billion were cut in domestic programs, not including defense and homeland security. At the same time, Congress passed a $70 billion tax cut for the high income and the millionaires. Now, I'm using the word cuts because that's the word they use, but in essence what that means is the federal government's revenue was decreased by $70 billion. So money coming into the revenue system that's used for the federal budget was decreased by that much. And I'm not here to pick on the top high-income earners or millionaires. That's not the issue. The issue is this. They, by doing these actions, cut out the revenue that should come to the government. And in order to offset that decrease in revenue, they cut $40 billion in domestic programs. One of the programs that took the worst hit in this was Medicaid. Even now, the United States is behind all the developed countries and several underdeveloped countries for some of the key indicators like healthcare, infant mortality rates, education, and the ability for people to move up out of their low-income status. These were some of the main areas that were cut in this last budget, and every one of them has an impact on increasing the level of hunger in the state. Child care, child support enforcement. In fact, the child support enforcement funds that were cut will reduce the ability of this state to collect about $21 million in child support as a result of this cut. Commodity supplemental food programs, which is a program that gives food to low-income seniors and children up to the age of 6, has been reduced. Foster care that's given to children by their relatives, the funding has been cut. Student loans have taken a very big hit. And Head Start, which is not only an education program for low-income children, but a nutrition program. Now the President has proposed the 2007 budget starting 2007 and the next 5 years. It's actually even beyond the next 5 years. And again, these are the big picture items. $182 billion cut in domestic programs and $285 billion cut in taxes for the top 1% and millionaires. And by the top 1%, I mean people earning $400,000 a year or more. Education, again, is taking a very big hit. The supplemental food program for seniors and poor children is going to be eliminated. The Community Services Block Grant, and some of you may be familiar with the Human Resource Development Councils in many parts of the state. We have one here in Missoula, the HRDCs, which help low-income people with multiple programs and assistance like energy assistance, housing, childcare, just a variety of things. That is proposed to be eliminated in the President's budget. The WIC program, which is a nutrition program for pregnant women, children, and infants, is being severely reduced. And low-income energy assistance has been reduced. Now, this is proposed, and I realize that this is an election year, so a lot can change between now and November. And maybe all of this may not happen if we're very fortunate. But there's a pretty good chance that a lot of it will happen in some form. And what happens when money is cut? Every state's budget gets between 30 and 50% of its budget from the federal government. So when money is cut at the federal level, that cut is passed on to the state. The state then has to figure out a way to either deal with it, add more money, or pass it on to the communities. In the end, it's the clients that feel the pinch and have to be deprived. And that brings us to talk about what is going on in this country. We have this low income, the poor on one side, and then we've got these tax cuts, enormous tax cuts for the very wealthy on the other side. The gap between rich and poor has continued to widen further and further. When Hurricane Katrina happened, I think it was very interesting, it certainly was for me, to watch how the news media and the public at large suddenly said, we have poverty in America and it's this bad? These people know that their houses are going to be flooded and they can't leave? What's going on here? And in a way, it was difficult to watch that reaction, because there are people in Montana and other states that are going through their own Katrinas in a smaller form every day that we don't recognize. It takes a catastrophe to recognize that there's a problem here. You know, I think that's a disgrace. We're seeing alarming trends in the budgets. We're seeing continued cuts in the domestic funding. We've seen programs, the entitlement as well as discretionary, being cut. And finally, the ultimate straw is that the domestic programs are being blamed for the deficit, and that's being used as a justification for cutting funding in domestic programs. So I'd like to end on a little happier note, which is the promises of ending hunger. You know, this country has the capacity to do something positive if we make that choice. At the congressional level, they need to invest in the nutrition safety net. We already have a nutrition safety net, but instead of strengthening it, it has been weakened, and we need to reverse that. We need to make sure that the food stamp program, the school nutrition programs, programs for seniors, and other food programs get adequate funding. And we want our congressmen to vote against the 2007 domestic program cuts. At the state and local level, we need to do the same to strengthen nutrition programs. Make sure that access to the programs is easy, not complicated, and stigma-free, so that people feel comfortable asking for food assistance in the sustainable manner. The reasons why food banks have such a demand is they treat people very well, and it makes it easier for people to come there for assistance. We need to actually legislate increased access to food, which is something that our state legislature needs to look at. In schools and communities, we want to make sure that every school has not only the lunch program, but the breakfast program. There are many schools that still don't have the breakfast program. You want to make sure every school has a summer food program. I mean, think about what happens to poor families when school is out in summer. There's no breakfast and no lunch. And it's a very hard time for parents to feed the kids then. We need to promote the farm-to-school programs and work with developing local agriculture in a way that helps the low income. And in Missoula, there's been some tremendous work going on, both in terms of farm-to-school programs at the university, and now they're starting it in the schools, and ways to develop local agriculture so that it brings better nutrition to low-income people. In terms of business and industry, we have to raise the minimum wage. Last year, a study was done that showed that in Montana, it takes a single person $9.07 an hour to survive without being poor. Well, we're far from that. And that's for a family of one. For a family of four, I think their estimate was something like $19 an hour to survive and get out of poverty. We're far from that. We have to have health insurance, support child care, And we have to get our local feeding institutions, the hospitals, the cafeterias, the public feeding places, the schools, to buy local food so that we also support local agriculture. As individuals, we need to learn about the issues and communicate to Congress. And you've probably all heard this before, but I have to say it again. It really makes a difference when our congressmen hear from you. It really does. Try to raise awareness about hunger in Montana and about the gap between the rich and the poor. I think ultimately we have to ask the question, what are we as a society willing to accept in the human condition? I mean, are we happy with the status quo where some segment of the population is living the way it is? Are we okay with that? Or should there be some more shared sacrifice between rich and poor, not just to balance the federal budget, but in equity of the whole lifestyle? So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Minkie, would you like to take that 8-minute question?
I'd love to, yes. That's why I tried to stop earlier.
So it's open for questions.
Minkie, a number of organizations have ways of delivering report cards on politicians in terms of how they bring on certain issues, such as teachers' unions and Democratic Party and stuff. Is there a report card out there for how Montana's politicians do in terms of voting on hunger-related issues?
I don't know if there's a report card as such, but it's information that Kate and I get all the time. We have a record of how they vote. I don't know that it's published as such. That's a good question. That would be very interesting. Yeah, and partly it's not, you know, it would be great to do that actually, now that you mention it. Especially if it could be done in a way that shows that it's not just the food programs that they support or not support, but the other domestic programs. Yeah, and I mean, the information is there, but it would be nice to have a report card. Yeah.
I was just going to suggest that one good indicator is how our representatives voted on the current budget that just got passed. That's a really strong statement on where they stand on.
I can tell you.
I can too.
Yeah, Senator, this is the 2006. The 7 has just been introduced. Senator Baucus voted against it, and Senator Burns voted for it, as did Congressman Rehberg. And I have to say that last year, we have been involved in the activities of the federal budget for some time now. And last year, we worked closely with Senator Baucus because he is on the ranking member on the Finance Committee, and also he's on the Agriculture Committee. And he did a remarkable job of trying to save cuts in Medicaid, as well as he had an initiative in the Senate to kill any cuts in the food stamp program, as the president had suggested. Well, his initiative didn't pass, but in the end, food stamps were saved in that budget. So I think he made a lot of effort there. And he had our study report with him. We made sure he had this information. Yeah. Yes.
What politician is Montana's worst threat to this, would you say?
Politician, you mean on a national scale?
From Montana.
You know, overall, I think our 3 congressmen are very concerned about the state. I do think that some of them are put in a difficult position because of party line. I personally had a very long chat with one of Congressman Rehberg's aides last month in Washington, and the person was fully convinced that the tax cuts for the wealthy were going to benefit the rest of the country. They truly believed it. It's an ideological thing. And I don't think I have that here. I have a few other pieces of information of the gap between rich and poor. No, I don't have that here. But there are studies that show that that same philosophy was used in the Reagan years, you know, the trickle down, and that this was going to create jobs and improve the economy. And in fact, that was not the case. And as far as this administration is concerned, based on what the experts tell us and based on the Congressional Budget Office numbers, job growth rate has been much slower than it should be if all these tax cuts would help. But I think that our congressmen are caught in that, and I think Senator Baucus finds it easier to oppose than the other two, what's being suggested, so it's a problem. Yes.
This is not a question, it's just disagreeing. I don't think they're caught. I think it's a choice. And I think that as representatives of Montanans, they represent rich and poor and people who are hungry and people who are wealthy, and it's their choice. I find it so difficult to believe that Representative Rehberg's aide really believes that. Maybe I'm a cynic, but I don't give them the credit for being caught. That's...
You know, you have a very good point. That's absolutely right, because there are many, many Republican congressmen that have also opposed the 2006 budget and have already raised serious concerns about the 2007 budget. But our two have not done that, unfortunately. They've got to hear from all of you. They've just got to hear from you. Yes?
If our local institutions buy local food, that could be a huge amount of food, which I would support that. How do you envision that maybe taking place? Is it something like the open space bond that we start reinvigorating local agriculture, or how does that maybe happen?
Well, you know, we have an expert sitting right here, Bonnie Buckingham from the Missoula Food Bank, who's also on the Community Food and Agriculture Council. Bonnie, would you like to? Putting you on the spot.
The Community Food and Agriculture Coalition is looking seriously at different tools that can be used, including possibly bond measures, but also creating other kinds of incentives that local ranchers and farmers can use to put their farm either under easements or different ways of making sure that it doesn't just become open space, but that it's actually working agricultural land. And we should start to see some things coming out this summer where that will actually improve improvements happening. So, and also looking as different initiatives come up in the county and the state, and really doing that, making some comment and influencing how things are at a policy level. I can talk about that when I come on stage.
I think we're out of time. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for the presentation.